August 12, 1953. A sterile room buried 3 stories beneath Dzerzhinsky Square, Moscow. This was the heart of the KGB's Second Chief Directorate, the unsleeping nerve center of Soviet counterintelligence. Major Yuri Volkov pressed his fingers against his temples, staring at a file that should not exist. The photographs spread across his desk were impossible. They showed the interior of a closed military research facility in the Urals, documents that had never left a vault, and the faces of scientists whose names were state secrets. The Americans knew everything. But how? For months, a phantom had been bleeding the Soviet Union dry. Technical specifications for the new T-54 tank vanished from design bureaus in Leningrad. The deployment schedule for the Northern Fleet's submarine force appeared in CIA briefings weeks before the ships left port. The exact yield calculations for Soviet nuclear weapons tests reached Washington before the dust had settled in Kazakhstan. This was not ordinary espionage. This was a hemorrhage. Volkov's world was one of shadows and paranoia, where trust was a luxury the state could not afford. Every engineer was a potential traitor. Every diplomat could be compromised. Every military officer might be selling secrets for Western gold or ideology. The KGB's doctrine was absolute. The enemy is everywhere. Trust no one. Verify everything. They had built the most extensive surveillance apparatus in human history. A web of informants and surveillance that touched every corner of Soviet society. And yet, someone was slipping through. The file in front of Volkov had a single word stamped across it in red Cyrillic letters: Homer. It was the code name for a mole, a traitor so deeply embedded in the Soviet system that he had access to everything. The evidence was fragmentary, but damning. Leaked documents bore the fingerprints of someone with access to the Council of Ministers. Communications intercepts suggested a handler operating from the British Embassy. The pattern was clear to those trained to see it. This was not a network of small-time informants. This was a master spy at the highest levels of power. What Volkov didn't know, what would haunt Soviet intelligence for decades, was that the betrayal went even deeper than he feared. The Americans and British weren't just running one mole. They were running several. And the crown jewel was a man the British called Agent Homer, known to history by his real name, Donald Maclean. But Maclean was merely the tip of an iceberg that included Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, and others who had burrowed into the very soul of Western intelligence before some turned, and others revealed the extent of penetration on both sides. The paranoia this created was all-consuming. Stalin himself had institutionalized suspicion as state policy. After the Great Purge of the 1930s, where he had executed his own generals and party officials on the mere suspicion of disloyalty, the Soviet system had become a machine that devoured its own. Now, in the early Cold War, that same paranoia was weaponized against an enemy that seemed to know their every move. The Americans were always one step ahead, and someone inside was helping them. Volkov lit a cigarette, the harsh Russian tobacco burning his throat. Around him, other officers worked in grim silence, sifting through intercepted communications, analyzing defector testimonies, building charts of suspected spy networks. The room hummed with the sound of teleprinters and the quiet murmur of men trading suspicions. This was the invisible war, fought not with tanks and bombers, but with lies, dead drops, and midnight arrests. For every Soviet spy the West uncovered, there had to be 10 more they hadn't found. At least, that's what Volkov told himself. But deep down, in a place he would never admit even under interrogation, Volkov felt the cold touch of doubt. What if the system itself was flawed? What if the very structure that demanded absolute loyalty had created the conditions for perfect betrayal? In a society where everyone informed on everyone, where fear was the currency of survival, perhaps the greatest spies were simply those who had learned to wear their masks the best. The Americans had turned this paranoia into a weapon. They didn't need to recruit everyone. They just needed the Soviets to suspect everyone. The ghost in the machine was real, and it was winning. November 1962. The Caribbean Sea. Depth 300 meters. Captain 2nd Rank Valentin Savitsky gripped the railing of the conning station aboard submarine B-59, his knuckles white with tension. The air inside the diesel-electric boat was thick, hot, and poisonous. The temperature had climbed past 50 degrees Celsius. Men were collapsing from heat exhaustion. The carbon dioxide scrubbers were failing. And somewhere above them, American destroyers were dropping practice depth charges, each explosion a hammer blow against the hull that rattled every nerve in every man's body. They had been submerged for days, out of contact with Moscow, cut off from the world. The last orders Savitsky had received before diving were clear. Deliver your cargo to Cuba, avoid detection, do not surface unless absolutely necessary. But that was before the blockade, before the American Navy had turned the Caribbean into a steel trap. Now, his submarine was being hunted like a wounded animal, and his crew was dying by degrees in the suffocating darkness. What the Americans hunting him didn't know, what would only be revealed decades later, was that B-59 carried something far more dangerous than torpedoes. Locked in a special compartment, guarded by an officer with orders sealed in wax, was a 10-kiloton nuclear torpedo. It was a weapon of last resort, authorized for use if the submarine was under direct attack and could not communicate with Moscow. The decision to use it rested with 3 men: Savitsky, the political officer Ivan Maslenikov, and the flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, who happened to be aboard. Another depth charge detonated close by, the shock waves slamming through the hull like the fist of an angry god. Light bulbs shattered, men screamed. Savitsky's visions swam with exhaustion and rage. They were being humiliated, tortured, driven to the breaking point by an enemy that didn't even have the decency to kill them cleanly. In that moment, Savitsky made a decision that could have ended the world. "We're going to blast them," he shouted over the chaos. "We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not become the laughingstock of the fleet." His hand moved toward the safe that contained the authorization codes for the nuclear torpedo. This was the reality of Soviet submarine operations during the Cold War. A grinding, suffocating nightmare of outdated technology pushed beyond its limits. The Americans had nuclear-powered submarines that could stay underwater for months, move silently at high speed, and operate in comfort. Soviet diesel boats like B-59 were noisy, slow when submerged, and could only stay down for days before needing to surface to run their engines and recharge batteries. The crews endured conditions that bordered on inhuman, all in service of a strategic doctrine that demanded they challenge American naval dominance despite having inferior tools. But in that moment, with his hand on the key to nuclear war, Savitsky was stopped by a voice. Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla commander, stepped forward. He was a quiet man, not given to dramatic gestures, but he carried a moral authority that even the enraged captain could not ignore. Arkhipov had survived the K-19 disaster the previous year, when a nuclear reactor meltdown had killed 8 men and exposed dozens more to lethal radiation. He had stared into the abyss of nuclear catastrophe and somehow walked away. Now, He used that terrible knowledge to stay Savitsky's hand.
"We cannot be certain," Arkhipov said, his voice cutting through the noise. "We do not know if war has been declared. We cannot contact Moscow. If we launch, we may be starting a war that has not yet begun." The two men locked eyes in the red emergency lighting of the submarine's control room. Around them, the crew watched in terrified silence. The decision hung in the toxic air, a moment of perfect balance between annihilation and survival. Savitsky's hand slowly withdrew from the safe. The moment passed. B-59 would eventually surface, humiliated and defeated, forced to turn back to the Soviet Union under American escort. But the world would live. Arkhipov had done what the entire Soviet military doctrine said was impossible. He had chosen restraint over retaliation, survival over honor. He had saved the world, and no one would know for 40 years. This incident revealed the terrible paradox at the heart of Soviet Cold War strategy. They had built weapons capable of ending civilization, placed them in the hands of men trained to never surrender, and then sent those men into situations where communication was impossible and judgment was clouded by exhaustion, fear, and pride. The Americans were guilty of the same insanity, but Soviet submariners operated under conditions that made catastrophic miscalculation almost inevitable. They were warriors fighting a war that could never be won, only survived. And they did so in steel coffins beneath the waves. The depth charges continued to fall, but B-59 would live to tell its story. A story of how close humanity came to extinction because of machines, doctrines, and the unbearable pressure placed on men asked to make God's decisions with mortal understanding. April 12, 1961. Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakhstan. Senior Lieutenant Yuri Gagarin sat alone in the cramped spherical capsule of Vostok 1, perched atop 280 tons of rocket fuel and Soviet ambition. Through the small porthole, he could see technicians scurrying across the launch pad, making final checks. In less than an hour, he would either become the first human in space or die in a fireball visible from 3 republics. The odds, he had been quietly told, were roughly even. This was the reality that Soviet propaganda would never show. Gagarin was a test pilot, strapped into a machine that had killed dogs on previous attempts, controlled by computers that sometimes failed, riding a rocket designed in frantic haste to beat the Americans. The space race was not a noble scientific endeavor. It was a propaganda war, fought with the lives of men who had no choice but to volunteer. And Gagarin, with his winning smile and farm boy charm, was the perfect face for a gamble that could easily become a tragedy. What the world saw was triumph. The first man in space, orbiting the Earth, proving Soviet technological superiority. Gagarin's smiling face was plastered on posters from Berlin to Beijing. "The motherland has shown the way to the stars," the headlines screamed. Children were named Yuri in his honor. He became an instant global celebrity, a symbol of communist achievement. But what the propaganda machine carefully hid was the desperate, reckless nature of how that triumph was achieved. The Vostok program was built on corners cut and risks accepted. Unlike the methodical, safety-obsessed American approach, Soviet rocket engineers under Sergei Korolev were given impossible deadlines and told to deliver or face consequences that went beyond professional failure. The Soviet system did not tolerate excuses. When Korolev said a rocket would fly by a certain date, it flew, even if the testing was incomplete, even if the systems were untested, even if the cosmonaut's survival depended on luck as much as engineering. Gagarin knew this.
In the weeks before launch, he had written a farewell letter to his wife, to be opened only if he didn't return. He had said goodbye to his daughters without telling them why. He had made peace with his death because that was what the motherland required. This was not courage in the abstract. This was the courage of a man who understood he was expendable, a component in a machine built to prove ideological superiority at any cost. The moment of launch was pure chaos, barely contained. The engines ignited with a roar that shook the steppe. Gagarin felt the acceleration crush him into his seat, his vision narrowing to a tunnel, his ribs creaking under the G-forces. The rocket climbed through a wall of fire and smoke, every second a potential disaster. Then, suddenly, silence. The engines cut off, and he was weightless, floating in his harness, staring at a view no human had ever seen. The curved blue horizon of Earth against the black void of space. For 108 minutes, Gagarin orbited the planet, a lone human in the cosmic dark, while on the ground, Soviet tracking stations anxiously monitored his vital signs and telemetry. The systems mostly worked. The capsule mostly responded to commands. When re-entry came, it was violent and terrifying. The spherical capsule tumbled and spun, heating to incandescent temperatures, while Gagarin fought to stay conscious. At 7,000 meters, the hatch blew away and he was ejected, parachuting separately from his spacecraft to land in a field where a startled farmer and her granddaughter watched a man in an orange flight suit descend from the sky. He had survived. The gamble paid off. The propaganda victory was complete. But in the years that followed, as more cosmonauts followed Gagarin into space, the terrible cost of the Soviet space program became clear. Vladimir Komarov would die in 1967 when his Soyuz 1 capsule's parachute failed to deploy, plummeting to Earth like a meteor while he screamed curses at the engineers who had sent him up in a spacecraft he knew was flawed. Valentin Bondarenko had already burned to death in a training accident kept secret for decades. Others would die in tests, in failures, in accidents covered up to preserve the illusion of Soviet infallibility. Gagarin himself would die in 1968, in a mysterious plane crash that has never been fully explained. Some say it was a simple training accident. Others whisper about sabotage, about alcohol, about a system that chewed up its heroes and spat them out. What is certain is that the man who proved humans could reach space died senselessly, pointlessly, in the sky he had mastered. The space race was sold to the world as humanity's greatest achievement. For the Soviets, it was something darker, a demonstration that they would sacrifice anything, anyone, to prove their system superior. They reached the stars first, but they built the ladder from the bones of men who had no choice but to climb. September 1972, Reykjavik, Iceland. The final game of the World Chess Championship. Boris Spassky, the Soviet grandmaster and defending champion, sat motionless at the board, staring at a position that was slowly, methodically being dismantled by an American savant named Bobby Fischer. Around them, the world watched. This was not just a chess match. This was the Cold War, played out on 64 squares, and the Soviet Union was losing. For decades, chess had been a Soviet obsession, a carefully cultivated symbol of intellectual superiority. The state poured resources into chess academies, trained grandmasters from childhood, and treated the World Championship as a matter of national pride. Every Soviet champion, from Botvinnik to Petrosian to Spassky himself, was held up as proof that communist education produced superior minds. The Americans played basketball and baseball. The Soviets played chess. And they always won. Until Fischer. The American was brilliant, erratic, and utterly uncontrollable. He made impossible demands, walked out of games, complained about lighting and cameras and the color of the pieces. The Soviet delegation was baffled. This was not how a serious chess player behaved. But beneath the chaos was a mind of terrifying clarity. Fischer played chess like a machine, calculating 20 moves ahead, finding weaknesses that Soviet grandmasters had trained their entire lives to defend. Game after game, he crushed Spassky, and with each loss, a piece of Soviet prestige crumbled. Spassky felt the weight of an entire system on his shoulders. He was not just playing for himself. He represented the motherland, the party, the superiority of Soviet education and culture. Losing was not an option. But he was losing. Sitting across from him was a man who played chess as if the rules of socialist realism and collective achievement simply did not apply. Fischer was a lone genius, unburdened by committees or ideology, and he was destroying the carefully constructed myth of Soviet intellectual dominance. The Soviet approach to chess was systematic and thorough. Grandmasters were supported by teams of analysts, coaches, and theoreticians. They trained together, shared knowledge, and built on generations of accumulated wisdom. It was chess as a collective endeavor, a reflection of socialist principles. Fischer worked alone, trusted no one, and seemed to reinvent chess theory from first principles in his own mind. He was the embodiment of Western individualism, and he was winning.
In the hotels and back rooms of Reykjavik, Soviet officials scrambled. There were accusations of cheating, demands for investigations, claims that Fischer was being helped by computers or psychological warfare. The KGB was involved, searching for any advantage, any explanation for how their champion could be faltering. But the truth was simpler and more damning. Fischer was better. The American had outprepared, outthought, and outplayed the pride of Soviet chess. The emperor had no clothes. When the final game ended, when Spassky resigned and stood to applaud his conqueror, the psychological impact rippled through the Soviet Union. If they could not even win at chess, their signature intellectual sport, what did that say about everything else? The space program was stalling. The economy was stagnant. Consumer goods were scarce. And now, an eccentric American had humiliated them on the world stage, in the one arena where Soviet superiority was supposed to be unquestioned. But the story of Soviet chess and defection runs deeper than Fischer's victory. It's the story of Viktor Korchnoi, a grandmaster who defected to the West in 1976, abandoning his wife and son to escape the suffocating control of the Soviet sports machine. Korchnoi spoke openly about how Soviet chess was poisoned by politics, how players were punished for ideological unreliability, how the KGB monitored their every move abroad, how brilliance was subordinated to party loyalty. The defection sent shockwaves through Soviet sports. If a grandmaster, given every privilege the state could offer, chose to flee to the West, what did that say about life in the Soviet Union? Korchnoi would go on to play against his former comrade Anatoly Karpov in 2 bitter World Championship matches, contests that took on the character of personal vendettas. The Soviets sent Karpov's team with KGB minders, parapsychologists, and even a hypnotist to try to unsettle Korchnoi psychologically. Chess had become psychological warfare, and the lengths the Soviets went to revealed their desperation. The pattern repeated across Soviet sports. Athletes who saw the West during competitions and realized they had been lied to about everything. Dancers, hockey players, chess masters. One by one, they defected. Each escape a small but devastating propaganda defeat. The Soviet system could train champions, but it could not make them want to stay. The golden cage was still a cage, and some birds chose freedom over medals.
Spassky himself would eventually emigrate to France in 1976, tired of being a symbol, exhausted by the pressure, disillusioned by a system that valued him only as a propaganda tool. The man who had carried Soviet chess on his shoulders walked away from it all, and the silence from Moscow was deafening. They could not admit that their heroes were leaving, could not acknowledge that the West offered something the Soviet Union could not: the freedom to be more than a servant of the state. The chess championship of 1972 was a turning point. It showed that individual brilliance could defeat collective systems, that freedom could outthink control, and that the Soviet model, for all its resources and planning, had fundamental flaws that no amount of ideology could overcome. November 9th, 1989, East Berlin. Lieutenant Colonel Viktor Petrov of the KGB stood in his office at the Soviet embassy, watching televisions tuned to multiple channels, all showing the same impossible scene: civilians with hammers and chisels attacking the Berlin Wall. His life's work, the entire architecture of Soviet power in Europe, was being dismantled by hand on live television, and nobody was stopping it. The East German border guards, trained to shoot anyone attempting to cross, stood by doing nothing. The wall, the ultimate symbol of the Iron Curtain, was falling, and Moscow was silent. For Petrov, this moment was the culmination of a slow-motion collapse he had watched for years but refused to believe was real. He had spent his career in the shadows, running agents, intercepting communications, protecting Soviet interests from enemies foreign and domestic. He had believed in the cause, in the historical inevitability of communist triumph. But somewhere along the way, the script had been rewritten, and nobody had told him. The signs had been there for those willing to see them. Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost, meant to reform and revitalize the system, had instead opened a Pandora's box of suppressed grievances and long-denied truths. The Soviet economy, always fragile behind the facade of military might, was collapsing under the weight of decades of mismanagement and the astronomical costs of the arms race. The war in Afghanistan had become a bleeding wound, the Soviet Union's own Vietnam, draining resources and morale while producing nothing but body bags and disillusionment. But more than the economic failures, more than the military quagmires, what was killing the Soviet system was something far simpler. It had lost the argument. For 70 years, the Soviet Union had promised that its system would deliver prosperity, equality, and a glorious future. Instead, it had delivered shortages, repression, and stagnation. The people of Eastern Europe had spent decades being told that life in the West was a capitalist hellscape of exploitation and misery. Then they had seen Western television, Western goods, and Western living standards through the cracks in the Iron Curtain. The lie was exposed. Petrov thought back to the SR-71 reports he had read years ago, the classified files detailing how the Americans had flown their spy plane over Soviet territory with impunity for decades. He thought about Fischer crushing Spassky at chess. He thought about the cosmonauts who had died in accidents covered up to protect the illusion of Soviet perfection. He thought about the submarines that broke down, the missiles that failed tests, the aircraft that couldn't match their American counterparts. The pattern was unmistakable. They had been outmatched, outspent, and outsmarted at every turn. The tragedy was that it didn't have to end this way. The Soviet Union had possessed brilliant scientists, brave soldiers, and a population that had endured unimaginable hardships with stoic resilience. But all of that human potential had been squandered by a system that valued control over innovation, ideology over truth, and the preservation of party power over the welfare of its people. They had built a superpower on a foundation of fear, and when the fear finally dissipated, there was nothing left to hold it together. On the television screens, young Germans from both sides of the wall were embracing, crying, celebrating. The cameras captured East Berliners flooding into West Berlin, staring in wonder at stores full of goods, at lights that actually worked, at a world they had been told was dying, but was clearly thriving. The contrast could not have been starker. On one side of the wall, abundance, freedom, opportunity. On the other, shortages, surveillance, decay. Petrov poured himself a glass of vodka, the good stuff reserved for senior officers, and drank it in one bitter swallow. He understood now what the American Blackbird had really been. Not just a spy plane, but a message. A message that the Soviet system, for all its sacrifices and suffering, had lost the future. The Americans had built a machine that flew at the edge of space for hours. The Soviets had built an interceptor that could barely reach that altitude for minutes before its engines destroyed themselves. That single comparison told the entire story of the Cold War. The phone on his desk rang. It was Moscow, finally. The orders were brief and devastating. Do not intervene. Let events unfold. Prepare for withdrawal. The empire was not going to fight for its survival. It was going to quietly admit defeat and collapse inward. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist, fragmenting into independent republics, its ideology discredited, its military broken up, its moment in history concluded. As Petrov hung up the phone, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel in decades of service. Doubt. Not doubt about the immediate situation, that was clear enough. Doubt about everything that had come before. Had any of it mattered? The sacrifices, the victories, the secrets kept and lives destroyed in the name of the cause? What had it all been for, if it ended like this, with teenagers dancing on the rubble of a wall that was supposed to stand forever? Outside, the celebrations continued. Inside, Viktor Petrov sat in the gathering darkness of his office, a man whose world had ended not with a nuclear holocaust or a heroic last stand, but with a whimper, with the sound of hammers on concrete, and with the terrible realization that everything he had believed was a lie. The Cold War was over. The West had won. And he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand how he had been so wrong about everything.